Now let's look at conjugate acid-base pair. Let's look at conjugate acid-base pair. Now, according to Bronsted-Lowry, we've seen that an acid is any substance that does what? That donates proton, right? While a base is anyone that accepts. Is it not? Good. Now, an acid donates proton, right? After an acid have donated that proton, that acid becomes a conjugate base. If an acid donates proton, that acid becomes a what? What is resulting is a conjugate, is called the conjugate base. While if a base accepts proton, that substance formed is called the what? Conjugate what? Acid. Now this is what I mean. If you have something like this, now look at this, as this is the acid and this is the base, right? This is the acid and this is the base. If reaction takes place and we now have something like this, you notice that, please look up, you notice that A, I've donated proton, right? I've given off proton, right? This is the acid here, right? Is it not? And this is the base. Why is this one the acid? Because it can donate hydrogen ion, right? It can donate proton, right? This one cannot donate proton, it does not even have proton. So this is the acid and this is the base. Now, if this acid here gives out this proton, in this case, you see there's no H here again, right? Meaning that A has given off the proton, right? So this thing here, this A here becomes the conjugate what? Conjugate base. So when an acid gives out its proton, it becomes a conjugate base, right? Now this is the base here, right? And on the product side, you see that the base have accepted proton, hydrogen ion. When a base accepts hydrogen ion, we call that what? Conjugate what? Conjugate acid. Conjugate acid. Now they can ask you in exam to identify the conjugate acid-base pair. If you are asked to identify the conjugate acid-base pair, it's just acid here to the conjugate base. This is a conjugate pair. And this base here to the conjugate acid. This is a conjugate pair. Because removal of hydrogen from this one will give us this. Addition of hydrogen to this one will give us this. Do we understand the concept of acid, conjugate acid and conjugate base? If acid donates, gives out proton, acid donates proton, what is resulting is what? Conjugate what? Base. If a base accepts hydrogen, a proton, what is resulting is called the conjugate what? Acid. Now, the most important thing here is this. If the acid is a weak acid, it will produce a strong conjugate base. If the acid is a strong acid, it will produce a what? Weak conjugate base. If the base was a strong base, it will produce a what? Weak conjugate acid. If the base was a weak base, it will produce a what? Strong conjugate acid. In other words, the stronger the acid, the dash the conjugate base. The weaker the acid, the conjugate base, right? The weaker the base, the stronger the conjugate acid. That's it. I'll give you an example. I'll give you something to identify the base, the acid, the conjugate base, and the conjugate acid for me here. Now let's look at this. Conjugate acid and base pair. Now, we've known what an acid is and the conjugate base. We've known the base and the conjugate acid. Now, if we have these acids, let's try to write their conjugates. If you have this acid, remember, acid, according to Bronsted-Lowry, can give out proton, right? Hydrogen ion, right? So if you want to write the conjugate base of this, what do we do? It can give out one proton, right? So we now have what? This is the conjugate base. What will be the conjugate base here? What will be the conjugate base here? What will be the conjugate? We are just removing proton. You are just donating proton. Now, these are bases. Let's write the conjugate acid. Bases, what do? They accept, right? They accept proton, right? And when they accept proton, they become conjugate acid, right? They are now conjugate acid because they've accepted proton. They can now give out proton. So, conjugate acid. What's the conjugate acid of this? What's the conjugate base here? What's the conjugate base here? See, what's it? Minus, not 2 minus again. What should be here? So you see that if the base accepts proton, it becomes conjugate acid. If the acid donates proton, it becomes conjugate base. So these are examples. Write this down. Let's continue.